Hi, this is Give a Book, Give a Voice, and today we're reading I Survived the Great Molasses Flood, 1919, by Lauren Tarshies. Chapter 1. Wednesday, January 15th, 1919, around 12:30 p.m., the North End, Boston. 12-year-old Carmen Grasso was drowning. She was caught in one of the deadliest disasters in the history of Boston. A gigantic wave had crashed into the streets, a swirling, raging monster moving faster than a train. It turned buildings to rubble. It smashed wagons and motor cars and tossed trucks into the harbor. 21 people would soon be dead. Many more would be fighting for their lives. This killer wave wasn't made of water. It didn't come from the sea. This monstrous wave was made of a thick brown syrup, molasses. For years, millions of the gallons of sticky molasses had been stored in a building-sized metal tank. The hideous tank loomed over Carmen's neighborhood, blotting out the sun. In one ear-splitting moment, the molasses tank had exploded apart. Carmen and her best friend Tony had watched in horror as the tank began to shake. Its round steel sides bulged in and out. The tank seemed to have come alive, as if it was boiling with fury, ready to destroy. And suddenly, thousands of the steel bolts that held the tank together let go. Bang! 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 They blasted through the air like bullets fired from a machine gun. Seconds later, the metal tank blew apart completely. Jagged chunks of metal whirred through the air like knife-ringed birds. The molasses covered the air like a black roiling cloud. Then, with a thundering crash, it hit the ground. Instantly, the streets became raging rivers filled with wreckage. Chunks of wood and metal and glass overturned motor cars and wagons. Horses whinnied in fear. Screams of terror rang out. "Run! Get out of the way! Help me!" Carmen ran for her life, Tony right behind her, but the wave was moving too fast. Within seconds, the swirl of thick syrup had caught them. The molasses wrapped itself around Carmen's legs like millions of powerful snakes dripping with slime. It rose up to her waist, to her chest. She had to do something. And then he saw it. A broken wagon floating toward them. She and Tony both managed to climb on until a huge hunk of metal from the tank rammed into the wagon. Carmen tried to hold on as the wagon nearly flipped, but she slipped off and sank to the swirling flood of ooze. "Carmen!" Tony screamed. It was the last sound Carmen heard as the molasses rose up over her head and swallowed her whole. Almost 4 months earlier, Carmen and her pal Tony were heading back from school, making their way through the noisy streets of the neighborhood, Boston's North End. Horse wagons clattered and squeaked, and motor cars honked. A young newsboy shouted the front page headline, "Deadly flu hits Boston." Usually, Carmen and Tony would be talking and joking as they zigzagged their way through the packs of people that jammed the street. They would maybe stop at Ortelli's bakery and see if they could sweet talk Mr. Ortelli into giving them a free creamy cannoli or crunchy biscotti. They always left empty-handed, but they kept trying because anything was possible. But today Tony was in a rotten mood. He walked glumly, skinny shoulders slumped. Carmen had been trying to cheer him up, but nothing was helping. "He hates me," Tony moaned. "He was their teacher, Mr. Lawrence." "No, he doesn't," Carmen said for the 100th time. "Mr. Lawrence was the nicest teacher they ever had. Over the summer, he'd come back from fighting in the Great War. He'd been badly hurt in a bomb attack and couldn't go into battle. So he came home and took a job as a teacher. He had a bad limp, but he acted like it didn't bother him." "I'm stupid," Tony continued. "No, you're not," Carmen said, rolling her eyes. How many times had she told him that he just had to study harder, or maybe open a book for once? That was why Tony flunked their first big math test of the year. Carmen knew it wasn't the F that upset him. He had plenty of those over the years. It was Mr. Lawrence's new idea to keep Tony in at recess so they could play some math games together. Carmen knew Mr. Lawrence was trying to help Tony. Tony thought Mr. Lawrence was trying to torture him. That test was impossible, Tony grumbled, now as they wove around a big pile of horse manure in the street. "Well," Carmen said, she got an 100, but she hadn't told Tony that. She carefully folded the test and slipped it into the pages of the book Mr. Lawrence had lent her, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. The book was about a girl named Dorothy who gets sucked into a tornado and dropped into a strange land called Oz. Carmen couldn't wait to show the test to Papa. He'd pin her perfect test up on the wall with all the others. Then he'd pat her cheek. "This is why we came here to America," he'd say. They'd come here 4 years ago from a little village in Italy. The village was a beautiful place where Mama and Papa's families had lived for hundreds of years. But in 1908, a powerful earthquake struck the south of Italy. Entire cities turned to dust in the quake. Minutes later, gigantic tidal waves roared across the land. More than 100,000 people were killed, including Mama, who was swept away when the sea rose up. Carmen had only one memory of that terrible day, dim and hazy like a dream. She was clinging to Papa's back as the sea churned all around them. "Hold on," Papa had cried. "Hold on." Papa's voice had risen above the roaring waves, above the screams of people all around them. Carmen gripped the wonderful Wizard of Oz harder as Tony kicked a rotten apple core into the gutter. Papa never talked about the earthquake. While growing up in Italy, Carmen had heard the stories from her grandmother, Nonna, and reminders of the disaster were everywhere in their village. The crumbling church, the ruined school, and the graveyard where Mama was buried. Papa had wanted to stay in the village, but as the years crawled by, he realized there was no future there, especially for Carmen. The school never reopened, and most girls didn't go to school anyway. It was harder and harder for Papa to earn money as a farmer. And that's why when Carmen turned 8, she and Papa got into a big ship and came here to America. They had begged Nonna to come with them, but she'd refused. "Someone needs to stay and watch over this place, Tesorora," she told Carmen. That's what she told Carmen, her treasure. Carmen hated leaving Nonna, but she had been curious about the magical land across the Atlantic Ocean, La America. Carmen had imagined golden streets, skyscrapers topped with rubies, wide open spaces where she and Papa would build their new life. Life would be much easier in La America, she was sure. Carmen smiled to herself now, remembering how shocked she was when she and Papa first arrived here in the North End. She glanced around, flashing her eyes to how all this looked through her 8-year-old eyes. The sagging buildings, the piles of trash, the dark alleys filled with howling dogs. She and Papa lived in an apartment so small there was barely enough room for the two of them, and the family of rats that refused to leave. What was Papa thinking? She ran to Nonna. "We've made a big mistake coming here. Why would anybody want to live in America?" But Nonna wrote her back, telling her to be patient. "Trees don't grow overnight," she said. Why was Nonna writing about trees? Carmen had wondered. There was hardly any trees in the North End anyway. But soon Carmen understood what Nonna meant. It took time to get used to this place. Like trees, she and Papa slowly grew into their new lives in the North End. She still missed Nonna, of course, more and more even. And sometimes Carmen had to escape the crashing noises and crushing crowds. She'd find a quiet spot in her favorite park, close her eyes, and pretend she was back in the village. She'd picture the Italian flag flapping in the town square with its stripes and shield. Sometimes she could practically smell the sweet Italian breezes, mix of lemons and flowers and the sea. But the North End was her home now. She loved school. There was always something new to see in this bustling city. And most of all, she loved her neighbors, Tony and his big, noisy family. They lived in the apartment right above them. They had welcomed Carmen and Papa from the start. Most nights, the delicious smells of Miss Grasso's cooking wafted under their doors, and most nights, Miss Grasso sent one of the kids down to invite her and Papa to join them with heaping plates of pasta or bullets of garlicky soup with chi-chi beans. Carmen glanced over at Tony now, smiling to herself. He was more like a brother than a best friend. She hated seeing him so sad. But then she had an idea that would definitely cheer Tony up. "Come on," she said, grabbing his arm. "I'll race you to the molasses tank." That was I Survived the Great Molasses Flood.